Sarah Thompson and Mark Thompson seemed like the perfect couple, living a quiet suburban life with 2 children and a picture-perfect home. But behind closed doors, a dangerous secret was brewing. Sarah's affair with a mysterious man named David would unravel their lives, turning desire into obsession and trust into betrayal, ultimately leading to a murder that shocked everyone who thought they knew this family. Sarah Thompson's life looked perfect from the outside. She lived in a quiet, leafy suburb in a house that could have come straight out of a magazine, with a manicured lawn, white picket fence, and windows that gleamed in the morning sun. Her husband, Mark, was successful, kind, and attentive, or so it seemed. They had 2 children, ages 6 and 8, who filled the house with laughter and energy. Friends often said Sarah and Mark were the ideal couple, the kind people everyone admired. Their social media posts showed family vacations, birthday celebrations, and smiling snapshots that painted a picture of happiness. But behind closed doors, the picture was far from perfect. Sarah spent hours away from home, claiming extra work commitments or errands, but her excuses were increasingly vague. Mark, caught up in his own demanding career, trusted her implicitly and never questioned her explanations. He assumed she was simply overworked, exhausted, or needing a break from domestic life. Yet Sarah was living a double life. She had met a man named David at a charity gala 6 months earlier, and what began as casual conversation quickly evolved into something more intense. David was charismatic, attentive, and experienced in ways Mark had never been. He gave Sarah a sense of excitement and thrill that she had forgotten existed, and soon her thoughts were consumed by their secret meetings. The affair started innocently enough, with coffee dates and lunch meetings under the guise of work obligations. Sarah justified it to herself, telling herself that she was still committed to her family, that the thrill of the affair did not diminish the love she had for Mark. But the encounters grew bolder. Secret dinners at dimly lit restaurants, late-night drives to secluded spots, and messages sent under the cover of night became a part of her life. With every meeting, the web of lies tightened around her. She learned to be careful, to cover her tracks, to delete messages and hide receipts, but fear and excitement often tangled together in a dangerous mix. Mark remained oblivious, believing his marriage was intact. He noticed minor changes, Sarah's late nights, distracted behavior, but he dismissed them as stress or fatigue. Friends remarked on her newfound beauty routines and elegant attire, but again, Mark thought it was simply her taking care of herself. He had no idea that every smile she wore in public, every tender gesture at family events, masked a secret life fueled by desire and risk. As the months passed, the tension in Sarah's life grew. She felt exhilarated and terrified simultaneously. The thrill of being with David was addictive, but the guilt gnawed at her, leaving her restless and anxious when she was alone with Mark. Each lie she told was a small betrayal, yet each betrayal pulled her further from the life she had promised herself she would protect. Despite the danger, she could not stop. Every stolen moment with David was like a spark in the darkness, illuminating a side of herself she had long ignored. The cracks in her perfect life were widening, and Sarah seemed unaware that the choices she was making would soon lead to consequences far beyond her control. What had begun as a harmless escape was slowly becoming a dangerous obsession, one that threatened not only her marriage, but the lives of everyone around her. The quiet suburban life she had once taken for granted was about to be shattered, and the fallout would leave a trail of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately, tragedy. The more time Sarah spent with David, the deeper she fell into a world she had never imagined. What had started as curiosity and excitement soon became a consuming obsession. David had a way of making her feel alive, noticed, and desired in a way that her life with Mark no longer did. He was attentive to her every mood, remembered the smallest details about her day, and praised her in ways that made her feel extraordinary. With him, she could escape the routines of suburban life, The endless laundry, the school drop-offs, and the meetings that left her exhausted but invisible. Each encounter with David became a drug she could not resist. Sarah began planning her days around these secret meetings, calculating every detail to avoid suspicion. She learned to manipulate schedules, create false errands, and fabricate work commitments. Every lie became more intricate, yet she carried them with confidence, convincing even herself that she was simply exploring a side of life she had long denied. But with each meeting, the danger grew. David's insistence on spending more time together clashed with her responsibilities at home, and she realized that a single misstep could expose her secret. Friends began noticing the subtle changes in her behavior. Sarah had always been friendly and approachable, but now she seemed distracted, even nervous. She laughed a little too quickly, checked her phone obsessively, and often seemed preoccupied with thoughts she could not share. Invitations she once eagerly accepted were declined without explanation, and she began withdrawing from social events where Mark would be present. People close to her whispered about the transformation but never guessed the real reason. She was living a life split in two, balancing the ordinary world of her family with the secret, exhilarating world she had found with David. Despite the thrill, fear was never far behind. Sarah knew the consequences of being discovered could be catastrophic. She imagined Mark uncovering her messages, finding receipts she had forgotten to hide, or seeing her return home late without explanation. The anxiety gnawed at her, but the lure of David's attention was stronger. Each stolen moment reinforced her desire, yet also increased the risk. She began to feel trapped in her own choices, caught between the excitement of the affair and the safety of the life she had built with Mark. David, for his part, was persuasive and relentless. He encouraged her to leave Mark, to pursue a future where they could be together without fear or deception. He promised passion, freedom, and a new life, portraying her current existence as suffocating and dull. Sarah's mind was torn. She loved her children and valued her home, yet she could not ignore the intoxicating pull of David's world. The tension within her grew unbearable, and every decision became a dangerous gamble. The affair intensified, spiraling into secrecy, lies, and risk. Sarah's days became a careful balancing act, and the weight of her choices pressed down on her. She found herself living in constant anticipation, checking clocks, planning escapes, and imagining moments when she could be with David without discovery. What had begun as a flirtation was now a dangerous game, a hidden world where desire and fear coexisted, and the consequences of one wrong move loomed ever closer. The life she had once known seemed distant, fragile, and increasingly unattainable. Mark's suspicion grew slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. He had always trusted Sarah completely, believing in the honesty of their marriage, but the small inconsistencies in her behavior began to accumulate like pieces of a puzzle he could not yet assemble. He noticed that she spent more time on her phone than before, often stepping into another room to take calls or send messages. There were unexplained late nights, vague excuses about work projects, and trips she said were urgent, but for which he could not verify the details. At first, he dismissed his unease as paranoia, convincing himself that he was simply imagining problems where none existed. Then came the little things he could no longer ignore. One morning he found a lipstick stain on a shirt he knew he had not worn, and a faint scent he did not recognize lingering in the house. He discovered a credit card charge at a restaurant he had never heard of, and a message left on the family computer that had been deleted from her phone. Each of these signs was small on its own, but together they painted a picture that Mark could not ignore. Doubt began to creep into his mind, a quiet suspicion that the life he thought he knew was built on deception. Mark's attempts to confront Sarah were careful, measured. He tried to approach her with subtle questions, hoping for reassurance or an explanation. But her answers were always vague, her demeanor calm, almost too controlled. She had learned to deflect, to manage the gaps in her story. and Mark found himself increasingly uncertain. His heart told him to trust her, but the evidence whispered otherwise. The tension between intuition and reality gnawed at him, leaving him restless and alert. Meanwhile, David's influence over Sarah intensified. He sensed Mark's growing suspicion and became more insistent that she take decisive action. Sarah, torn between loyalty and desire, felt the walls of her life closing in. Every secret meeting now carried the risk of exposure, and every lie was a thread in a web that threatened to collapse. The stakes were higher than ever, and the exhilaration of her clandestine affair was shadowed by fear. Mark's growing awareness created cracks in Sarah's carefully maintained facade. Her friends began to notice her anxiety, the restless movements, the glances over her shoulder. The pressure of keeping the secret weighed heavily on her, but she clung to David's promises of escape and fulfillment. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, tangible, and threatening to undo everything she had built. As the tension reached a boiling point, Mark began to document the evidence he could find, collecting details he had once ignored. He reviewed bank statements, text messages, and unusual receipts. The realization hit him slowly but firmly. The betrayal was real, and the man who had entered their lives carried the power to destroy everything. The affair had moved from fantasy into a threatening reality, and the careful balance Sarah had maintained was unraveling faster than she could control. The household that once seemed calm and ordinary now hummed with an undercurrent of suspicion, fear, and tension. Mark's growing awareness brought him closer to a truth he had long avoided, while Sarah found herself trapped in a maze of her own making. Each passing day heightened the danger, and the once hidden affair became a ticking clock, counting down toward consequences that no one could predict, but that were destined to be catastrophic. Fear and desperation consumed Sarah as the days passed. Mark's growing suspicion had shifted from quiet doubt to active investigation, and the walls of her carefully constructed secret life were closing in. Every glance he gave, every question he asked, made her pulse race and her thoughts spiral. David's reassurances that they could be together once Mark was out of the picture became louder, more insistent, and Sarah found herself listening, imagining a future she knew was impossible to reach without crossing a line she had never thought she would cross. The plan began as a whispered idea, something hazy and unformed, but it quickly took shape. Sarah knew that Mark's discovery of the affair would ruin everything: the house, the children, the image of a perfect life. Everything would collapse. She and David started discussing what needed to be done, each conversation sharpening their focus, each detail amplifying the risk. The idea of removing Mark from the equation, of silencing the threat permanently, shifted from a distant thought to a dark necessity. They chose a night when Mark was alone, believing that it would minimize complications and make the act seem like an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate crime. On the evening they had chosen, the house was quiet except for the faint sound of rain against the windows. Sarah moved through the rooms with a calm she did not feel, checking locks, arranging distractions, and ensuring that nothing would interrupt their plan. David arrived as planned, and together they executed the scheme they had discussed in hushed tones over weeks. What should have been a simple act was executed with careful timing, but in the heat of the moment, small mistakes were made, marks left behind, and evidence overlooked. Mark's body was discovered hours later, slumped in his study. At first, investigators believed it was a burglary gone wrong. The scene was staged to suggest an intruder had broken in, stolen valuables, and attacked the man. But as detectives examined the room, inconsistencies began to emerge. Furniture was out of place, items were deliberately displaced, and the position of the body raised questions. It became clear that this was no ordinary crime. The traces left behind hinted at something personal, something far more calculated than a simple robbery. As the investigation deepened, police began to uncover the hidden layers of Mark and Sarah's life. Financial records suggested manipulation, Text messages pointed to secret communications, and small inconsistencies in Sarah's account of her whereabouts painted a troubling picture. David's name surfaced quickly, tying him to Sarah and raising questions about their motives. The perfect facade of suburban life crumbled under scrutiny, exposing the dangerous intersections of desire, betrayal, and desperation. The night that was meant to secure a new future for Sarah and David instead became the turning point that would destroy them. The murder, intended to erase Mark from the picture, left a trail of evidence that authorities could not ignore. The calculated risk had tipped into catastrophe, and the hidden affair that had seemed thrilling and controllable was now a weapon that turned inward, threatening to consume everyone involved. What had begun as secret desire ended in violence, fear, and the first steps toward justice that would expose every lie and secret that Sarah had worked so hard to protect. The investigation into Mark's death quickly unraveled the carefully constructed web of lies. Detectives examined every detail of the crime scene, piecing together evidence that painted a story far more sinister than a simple burglary. Forensic analysis revealed traces that could only have come from someone familiar with the house, someone who had known Mark's routines. Fingerprints, overlooked at the time, and digital records of text messages between Sarah and David created a chain that investigators could follow. The hidden affair that had seemed private and inconsequential now became the central motive for murder. Sarah's attempts to maintain her innocence began to falter under scrutiny. Each interview revealed gaps, contradictions, and nervous behavior that drew attention. Investigators noted her careful avoidance of direct answers, the subtle tension in her posture, and the moments of hesitation when recounting her whereabouts. It became clear that she had been leading a double life, and the affair that she had once thought harmless was no longer a secret. The community that had trusted her, that had believed in her perfect marriage, now watched in disbelief as the truth emerged. David's involvement was equally damning. Communication records, photographs, and witness statements connected him to Sarah's plans and intentions. His role in Mark's death became increasingly evident as evidence of collaboration surfaced. Together, Sarah and David had not only carried out a calculated plan, but had tried to manipulate the scene to mislead authorities. Yet every attempt to disguise their actions only strengthened the case against them. Investigators began to reconstruct the events of that night with chilling clarity, exposing the sequence of decisions that had led from secret desire to murder. The trial that followed captured the attention of the local community and made headlines for its shocking revelations. Prosecutors detailed how passion and obsession had escalated into a deadly plan, illustrating how two lives, once seemingly ordinary, had intersected in a tragic and violent way. Evidence of the affair, combined with forensic findings and meticulous detective work, created a compelling case. The narrative that emerged was one of manipulation, deceit, and the devastating consequences of choices made in secret. Sarah and David's actions were no longer abstract moral failings. They were crimes with clear victims and irreversible consequences. Ultimately, both Sarah and David were convicted. The court sentenced them to lengthy prison terms, leaving behind a shattered family and a stunned community. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of the woman they had admired with the reality of her actions. The children, once surrounded by the security of a stable home, were left to navigate a world upended by betrayal and loss. The suburban streets that had seemed safe and serene now bore the shadow of a tragedy born from desire and deception. The story of Sarah, David, and Mark became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how secrets and passion, when left unchecked, can spiral into unimaginable consequences. What began as an affair, a thrill hidden in the background of everyday life, ended in murder, betrayal, and devastation. The consequences of their choices were permanent, leaving behind a legacy of heartbreak, grief, and warning that the allure of forbidden desire can lead to destruction beyond anyone's imagination.